The first web pages were quite simple, and the developers of the internet intended it for scientific information and military purposes. No one considered the internet might need to be pretty or have so many photos of cats. Developers tried to add display functionality to HTML, but the result was increasing amounts of formatting information becoming mixed in with the content. This had several disadvantages. The mishmash of code and content was hard for developers to read, but the main problem was that it was very inefficient. To make changes to the look of a website meant changing dozens or even hundreds of lines of code on every page. The answer was to separate the formatting information from the content, and CSS was born. Cascading Style Sheets work in conjunction with HTML. For example, HTML marks up sections of content as paragraphs, but CSS tells the browser what font, style, size, color, borders, and other display features a paragraph should have. Multiple web pages can be linked to a central style sheet, which means making changes to the CSS here will change the display of pages site-wide. So let's look at some simple CSS and how it can affect our web pages. Here I have a page of HTML code. It just uses simple markup for paragraphs and a couple of levels of headings. At the moment, the page is displayed using the default settings for paragraphs and headings in the browser. This can vary from browser to browser, so our page won't look exactly the same for every viewer. Let's use some CSS to take control of the display of our page. I have created a new blank document in a text editor. First, I need to tell the browser what HTML tag I want to set some rules for. This is called the selector. I'm going to set some basic settings for my whole page, so I'm going to use the body tag as my selector. This will apply these rules to anything inside the body tag on my page, and is a good starting point for setting some defaults. Now I've put a pair of curly brackets. CSS knows the rules within these brackets will apply to this particular selector. Let's set a background color for the page. I'm going to use the background color CSS attribute and set its value to a color, in this case DC D0FF, a fetching shade of lilac. Note the attribute is separated from the value by a colon, and the rule is finished with a semicolon. Every CSS rule follows this general structure. The color here is represented as a hexadecimal number that represents the strengths of red, green and blue light mixed up to make the color. Let's save our changes and refresh our page. Notice that nothing has changed. That's because I haven't linked our style sheet to this page. Let's do that now. Remember that the head section of a HTML page contains information for the browser. Here we're going to use a link tag to link our CSS page to this web page. The href attribute tells the browser where the CSS page is located. The rel attribute tells it it's a style sheet. The type attribute says the browser should expect to see a text file containing CSS. Now the CSS and HTML pages are linked, and the background color changes. Let's set a default typeface for my page. I do this using the font family attribute. Here I can set the font or typeface the browser should use for display of text on the page. I've told it to use Arial font. If we save the CSS and look at our page, the browser now displays the text as Arial. We need to be careful with fonts. Not all computers have the same fonts available. If it doesn't have the font you specify, it will have to guess. Luckily, CSS has an answer. We can use a list of font names and the browser will work along the list until it finds one it has available. Try and include at least one common font that is web-safe. CSS also recognizes a series of generic descriptors like serif, sans serif, comic, etc. If it can't find a specific match in the fallback list, at least it knows what type of font to try and display it with. We should always end our list with one of these generic values. So I've set my default background color and font. Let's get more specific. I'm adding a rule to make my large headings red. See, I'm using the H1 selector to tell the browser this rule applies to H1 elements on my page. Now I'm using the color attribute to set the headings to red. Because the H1 is inside the body, all those attributes still apply unless I explicitly set a different value for them. If I save the changes, now my H1 elements display following this rule. So this has introduced you to the basics of CSS. Let's recap. CSS is a separate language which works in conjunction with HTML. The aim of CSS is to separate formatting from content. HTML marks up the content and CSS defines how it will display. A link tag is used in the head of the HTML page to link it to the CSS. Multiple HTML pages can be linked to one CSS style sheet. This makes statewide format changes easy, as changes to the central CSS file will change the display of all linked web pages. A basic CSS rule uses a HTML element like body, paragraph, or headings as a selector. Rules for the selector appear within curly brackets. Each rule consists of a CSS attribute and an associated value, separated by a colon. Each rule ends with a semicolon.